On the November 29, 1970, a professor named Pathuel Mohn took his two young daughters for a walk in the Isdalen Valley outside Bergen, Norway. Isdalen, the Ice Valley, a place locals called the Valley of Death not for any specific reason, but because of its atmosphere, the steep walls, the grey sky that seemed to sit lower there than anywhere else, the silence that felt less like quiet and more like absence. The daughters found her first. A woman, lying on her back between two large rocks, partially burned, around her, an empty bottle of liquor, sleeping pills, a passport case empty. Her clothing labels had all been removed, every single one. The seams where the labels had been were cleanly cut, not torn. Someone had done this deliberately, before she died, or after, no one could ever establish which. The Norwegian police were called. They did everything correctly. They investigated thoroughly, followed every lead, reached out to Interpol, conducted forensic analysis at the highest level available at the time. 54 years later, she still has no name. She is called only the Isdal Woman, and she is one of the most fascinating, heartbreaking, and deeply strange unresolved mysteries in modern European history. The forensic examination of the Isdal Woman produced findings that investigators would spend decades trying to reconcile. She was a woman, approximately 25 to 40 years old, dark hair, between 1.6 and 1.7 meters tall, well-nourished, in good physical health before her death. Her teeth showed dental work consistent with Western European standards. The cause of death was listed as unclear. There were sleeping pills in her system, phenobarbital and phenol, a large amount, enough to incapacitate. There were burns on her body, significant ones. Whether she was dead before the fire was set, or whether she died in it, could not be definitively established. Her fingerprints had been burned away. Not accidentally. The burns on her fingertips were specific, isolated, inconsistent with the fire that had burned the rest of her. Someone had deliberately destroyed her fingerprints. Again, before her death or after, unknown. Around her body, the investigators catalogued the following items: an empty bottle of ODV, a type of clear fruit brandy, 12 pieces of unlabeled clothing, a few coins from various European countries, remnants of a passport holder empty, and slightly apart from the body, a pair of boots with the brand name removed from the sole. The boots were significant. Despite having the brand name removed, a forensic investigation in 2017, nearly 50 years after her death, was able to determine the manufacturer from the sole pattern. The boots were French, made in the late 1960s, sold only in France and a small number of European specialty stores. She had been in France recently, or at some point, she had been in France. That was all the boots could say. 2 days before the body was found, 2 suitcases had been left at the Bergen train station luggage office. When police traced the body back through Bergen's hotels, they eventually connected these suitcases to the Isdal Woman. Inside them was something extraordinary. Every item in the suitcases had its label removed, every single one. Clothing, toiletries, containers, anything that could be used to identify a brand, a country of origin, a purchase location, had been stripped or cut away with care and precision. But the Isdal Woman had made one mistake. A small one, the kind of mistake that suggests someone working under time pressure, or someone who was more meticulous about some things than others. On the bottom of one of the suitcases, written in the lining, partly obscured, partly visible, were a series of notations, letters and numbers in a sequence that made no immediate sense. Norwegian cryptographers looked at it, intelligence analysts looked at it, amateur codebreakers looked at it for decades. The current leading interpretation is that it was a simple substitution cipher, a basic code used to record hotel names and addresses in a disguised form. When decoded, the notations corresponded to hotels in Norway, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, and France. She had traveled extensively across Western Europe in the months before her death. She had recorded her movements in code, and she had removed every identifying label from everything she owned. This is not the behavior of a tourist. Police traced the Isdal woman's movements through the hotel registries of Bergen and surrounding areas. What they found built a picture of a woman who did not want to be found. She had used at least 9 different aliases across her European travels. 9 names, 9 different identities. Sometimes she was German, sometimes Belgian, sometimes she registered under names that suggested French origin. The handwriting on the hotel registration cards was consistent. It was always her writing, but the names, nationalities, and passport numbers changed constantly. Hotel staff who were interviewed remembered her in fragments. Some said she was quiet, polite, unremarkable. Others remembered her as slightly nervous, not obviously anxious, but with the kind of controlled stillness of someone who was always aware of the room around them. Several noted that she watched doorways. One hotel employee in Bergen remembered something specific. The woman staying under one of her aliases had asked him whether anyone had been asking about her. He had said no. She had thanked him and gone upstairs. The next morning she checked out 3 days early. In Bergen itself, witnesses placed her in the city during the weeks before her death. She was seen at the train station, at a pharmacy where she purchased, among other things, sleeping pills, alone, writing in a small notebook. No one spoke to her at length. No one knew her name. She moved through the city like someone who had learned to be invisible. 1970. Bergen, Norway, a port city, a NATO country, the Cold War at its sustained, grinding, invisible peak. When Norwegian intelligence services looked at what the police had assembled, the aliases, the coded travel records, the systematically removed labels, the destroyed fingerprints, they reached a conclusion that the official investigation has never fully confirmed or denied. The Isdal woman was an intelligence operative. Which side, and for what purpose, has never been established. She could have been a Western intelligence asset working for NATO, for a member state's foreign intelligence service, for any of a dozen agencies that operated in Scandinavia during this period. She could have been working for the Eastern Bloc. Soviet intelligence had extensive operations in Norwegian port cities, monitoring NATO naval activity. She could have been an independent operative, working for a smaller state or a private interest. None of the intelligence services that were asked, and several were asked formally and informally over the following decades, acknowledged knowing who she was. This is not, in itself, proof of anything. Intelligence services do not typically confirm the identities of operatives, living or dead, especially in cases that remain officially unresolved. But the combination of factors, the tradecraft evident in her behavior, the Cold War timing, the Bergen location, the destroyed identifying information, has led virtually every serious investigator to the same conclusion. She was not a civilian. And she was not alone in the world. Someone knew who she was. Someone sent her to Bergen. Someone knew eventually that she had died. And that someone has never come forward. The official verdict on the Isdal woman's death is suicide. This verdict has been disputed continuously since it was issued. The case for suicide: she had a large quantity of sleeping pills in her system. She was in an isolated location. The fire, while unusual, could theoretically have been set by her as a final act of self-destruction consistent with the same impulse that drove her to remove all identifying information. Someone who wished to die unidentified. The case against suicide: the burns on her fingertips were inconsistent with self-immolation. Setting yourself on fire does not typically produce the specific, isolated destruction of the fingerprint whorls found on her hands. The position of her body on her back, arms at her sides, was not consistent with someone who had burned alive. People who die in fire do not typically end up in relaxed positions. And there is one more detail. The sleeping pills found in her system were present in a concentration consistent with incapacitation, not necessarily with a lethal overdose. The amount she had taken would have rendered her unable to walk, unable to fight, unable to resist, but not necessarily dead. Someone who wanted to kill a person without leaving obvious marks of violence might first render them unconscious with pills, might then destroy their fingerprints, might then set a fire that would obscure the evidence further. This is a theory. It is not proven. It has never been proven. But it has also never been disproven. In 2017, NRK, the Norwegian public broadcaster, conducted an extensive reinvestigation of the Isdal Woman case using modern forensic technology unavailable in 1970. They extracted DNA from a tooth. They analyzed isotopes in the tooth enamel, a technique that can establish, with significant accuracy, the geographic region where a person grew up based on the mineral composition of local water sources absorbed during childhood. The isotope analysis suggested the Isdal woman had grown up in Central Europe, most likely Germany, or the German-speaking regions of Switzerland or Austria. This was consistent with several of her aliases, which had Germanic names. They submitted her DNA to international databases. No match was found. They released facial reconstructions based on her skull, detailed, scientifically produced images of what she likely looked like in life. These reconstructions were published internationally. No credible identification came forward. In 2019, Belgian investigators working cold cases found what they believed might be a connection: a woman who had traveled in similar patterns, under similar circumstances, in Belgium in the late 1960s. The connection was investigated. It led nowhere conclusive. The DNA profile exists. The isotope data exists. The facial reconstructions exist. Somewhere in the world, in a family archive, in an old photograph, in the memory of someone now very elderly, there is information that could close this case. It has not surfaced. It may never surface. The Isdal woman is buried in Melendal Cemetery in Bergen. Her grave marker says, Ukjent Kavin, unknown woman, November 1970. For years the grave was maintained by the city. Then, as decades passed, by volunteers, people who had heard her story and felt, in the way that some stories create, a specific obligation, a feeling that someone ought to tend to a grave that no family ever visits, that someone ought to remember a person that no one can name. People leave flowers there, regularly, strangers from Bergen and from other countries who have heard her story and made the trip specifically to stand at that stone and look at those two words, Ukjent Kavin, unknown woman. There is something in this that is difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The Isdal woman, whoever she was, spent her life building invisibility. 9 names, removed labels, burned fingerprints, a life constructed specifically so that no one could trace her, know her, find her. And in death, she became one of the most searched, most discussed, most intensely investigated unidentified persons in modern history. Thousands of people know her face, the reconstructed face, the face made from bone and estimated tissue and the careful work of forensic artists. Thousands of people know her story. No one knows her name. She is the most famous person nobody can identify. The flowers on her grave this week were red. Someone put them there on a Tuesday morning and walked away without leaving their own name. Maybe she would have appreciated that.